Welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're going to be facing dangers untold, venturing into the Great Maze to take a look at Goblins, the expansion for Jim Henson's Labyrinth board game. Now this was released in 2017 by Riverhorse and was obviously meant to be an add-on for the Labyrinth board game. Now I'm not going to do a review of the Labyrinth board game just now, and I'm not going to review these as part of the board game. I'm going to be looking at these miniatures, which is basically what this is. It's a pack of 5 miniatures, and we're going to be taking a look at how to paint them up. Because I know that these have been around for about 4 years, but there's still a lot of people who would like to paint these, take them from their plain grey state that they come in and paint them up so that they look really nice, either in the Labyrinth board game or in some other miniature game that you want to play. Now these board game pieces, these goblins were sculpted by Johnny Fraser Allen from Tabletop Troubadour Games, who is somebody who actually works for Weta Workshop, who've done lots of special effects for big movies like Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia. And the work, the sculpture that has been done on these pieces is absolutely phenomenal. They were originally sculpted 3 times larger than this out of plasticine, with metal ball bearings being used to add extra details like rivets or eyes. Those plasticine sculptures were then digitally scanned, cleaned up on the computer, shrunk down 3 times smaller and 3D printed. Those 3D prints were then molded, and these plain pieces were cast from those molds. So they are much smaller and they have softer detail from the original sculpts, but the original sculpts were done so well that these have come out absolutely beautifully, and they are a joy to behold and a joy to paint up. So what I'm going to be looking at today is exactly what colours that I've used in order to paint these, where I've used those colours, what kind of techniques I've used, and what order you should be looking at putting those colours on top of each other. So let's start by getting these pieces out of the box and taking a closer look at them. First up then is the Goblin Infantry, and this little guy, because of his size, is really nippy and speedy, so you're going to have to test against speed for him. He is the smallest of all of the figures in the expansion, so he is one of the most fiddly to paint, but there is a lot of detail in this sculpt, even given this tiny size. His eyes obviously are the hardest thing to paint about him. I have managed to get 3 colours in there, kind of yellow iris kind of base colour there, a black pupil and a white highlight in each eye, but only just because this was a really tricky one to paint. Now what amuses me about this guy is that on his card, the picture that they've used for the Goblin Infantry doesn't actually feature this character here. The thing is, it should, but it doesn't. This actual photograph that they've used has got this goblin in it, but they've cropped it so he's not actually in the picture. This little spike here that you can see is actually the top of his spiked helmet. They've completely cropped him out of the picture on this card, which is a little bit of an error there. You can see in this publicity still, if they cropped it a little bit lower, there he is. He is right there wearing that spiky helmet and looking pretty fierce. Now some of these goblins can be found in the book Goblins of the Labyrinth by Brian Froud and Terry Jones, featuring Brian Froud's original artwork. This little guy, however, does not seem to be one of them. The closest I can find in the book is this goblin here called Frollo, and as you can see, he's definitely not exactly the same, but there are quite a lot of similarities. This belly armor here is the same as on this guy, same with this kind of a spiked shoulder armor. They both share that. They've both got this helmet with the single spike on it, and even this kind of muzzled face is quite similar, although obviously there are a lot of differences. For example, the helmet is much fuller here and has got an eye covering, which this little guy does not have. So this little guy may have started out as Frollo and been developed further, or he might have started out as a different sketch which just doesn't feature in this book. Frollo, though, here is quite an interesting goblin. He is a famous goblin lunchball player. Lunchball being a goblin game which is kind of like football but played with two teams of 2,361 goblins in each team. Not only that, in order to play, you are trying to eat the ball. And the ball, of course, is 6 feet in diameter and is made of solid teak. So that would be quite something to see a game of that played. This little guy can be seen in the film, but he's not featured an awful lot. He can be seen at the beginning of the film in Toby's bedroom when the goblins are waiting to steal the baby away.
I wish the goblins would come and take you away right now. That's not hard, is it?
And he can also be seen later on with his helmet, which he's missing in the earlier scene in Toby's bedroom. He can be seen in the Dance Magic Dance music video in the Goblin Castle. But apart from those two scenes, he is not seen an awful lot in the movie. He's more of a background extra.
Oh, that's not it. Excellent. That rubbish. It doesn't even start with I wish.
Next up is the Goblin Infantry champion, I suppose, and these guys are featured quite heavily in the movie. They can be seen at the big fight in the Goblin City at the end, as featured on the card here. And of course, these guys are also seen attacking and tormenting Ludo when we're first introduced to that character. His little nipper stick here does not feature later on in the battle, but this is what is used to attack and torment Ludo. And again, there is really nice detail on here, particularly with the rivets, and this one was a really nice one to paint up. Lots of nice rust detail on there, and the little nippers, I absolutely love them. They're such a great character design. Now, there are obviously differences. For instance, this guy's got his nipper stick instead of a great big long axe, but it's pretty clear that this guy was based on the goblin Lurk from Froud's book. Now, the story of Lurk is a very sad one. It's so sad, in fact, that nobody knows it anymore. It was originally told several 150 goblin years ago, but the goblin that it was told to died of heartache, and so the story itself was banned and outlawed, and everybody has now forgotten it. It is, however, said that it involves an ungoblin world visitor who the Lurk, the goblin, fell in love with, only to return home one day to learn that his mother had made her into a cauliflower cheese. So it's obviously a tale of woe and heartache, never to be repeated again. And the last of our Goblin Infantry is this guy here, who you've got to outwit. Now, this goblin was featured in the movie, but again, he's a bit of a bit player. He's not in it an awful lot. He can be seen in Toby's bedroom at the beginning of the film, waiting to kidnap him.
Did you say it?
And he's also the same goblin who can be seen loading the cannon in the Goblin City in the big fight at the end.
Fire! Hey! I just fired you!
And you can see there's some absolutely beautiful detail on this guy. He's got his little wooden shield here, which doesn't actually feature in the movie, but it can be seen in some of the original concept art and on the original design maquette. He's also got his kind of shoulder armor here, which I've painted a kind of metal, grey metal colour in order to match it better to the maquette. But in the movie, it's more of a red colour. I decided rather in going with the red to go with this kind of metal colour instead. And he's got this big kind of war hammer here, which is something which does not actually feature in the movie at all. I've not seen any references to that, but it is a nice little touch there. And this little guy is clearly based on the goblin called Rome Baba from Froude's Book of Goblins. You can see almost everything about him is the same. He's got his shield here, he's got his shoulder armour, he's got his helmet with his 2 horns. The only kind of difference is this horn here has got this kind of wire in it, which is not on this one, which is interesting because the maquette of Rome Baba does also feature this wire section with the missing horn, but when it got into the movie, that was not present there. And Rome Baba is actually the Goblin Prime Minister, who is greatly loved and admired by the majority of goblins. Now, he's not very good, he's pretty dim-witted, but they do absolutely love the fact that on him lives the world's biggest flea. Once or twice a day, the flea will leap off of the Prime Minister and hop around the room, and if he leaps over any goblin, then that goblin will receive an endowment from the Prime Minister, equivalent to the amount of gold that can be stuffed into his right nostril. However, if the flea bumps into any goblin, then that goblin is declared to have infringed the Prime Minister's hairspace and is immediately executed. Moving on from the infantry, we've got the Goblin Artillery, which is sometimes known as the Gatling Goblin. And this guy shoots bullets pretty darn quickly, so you've got to be really speedy to get out of the way. So you're going to test your speed in order to overcome this. Now, this guy is featured in the movie in the big fight in the Goblin City at the end, and is quite a deadly foe before he gets crushed by one of Ludo's rocks. And you can see again there's lots of nice metal detail on here, lots that you can get different shades of metal into and that you can paint rust on. Now the back on here, the sculptor has said that there were no reference photographs. He was not seen from the back, so he had to make up that detail. But you can see he's done a really nice job there, and it definitely keeps in with the look of the rest of this character. He's just really, really nice and pretty deadly, this guy. I have had a look in the Goblins of Labyrinth book, but this design does not appear to be in there.
Hey, no problem.
And finally, we've got the Goblin Cavalry, or the Goblin Knight, and I absolutely love the design of this guy. It's just such a fun character, such a fun design for a costume that Henson came up with. I love it. And the knights are featured really heavily in the final battle in the Goblin City. So it's really nice to see them represented. Of course, there is more than the Red Knight. The Red Knight is the one that you do tend to see most often, and most people do seem to paint this guy up as the Red Knight. However, there were other colours, and I did consider painting them the other colours. There's a blue knight, an orange knight, a green knight, and one that's kind of got patchwork armour from all those different colours. But I thought the red was more iconic, so that's what I went for. And again, there is really, really lovely detail on this. This was a joy to paint up. I really enjoyed this guy. Being the biggest of the figures in the pack, it means that it's a lot easier to paint this one because it's not quite as fiddly, and you don't need such tiny brush work to get in on things like eyes. His steed here has eyes which are quite large compared to some of the other goblins, so that was quite a bit easier. The fiddliest thing, the hardest thing to paint on this was his lance, because it's got these red and white stripes. And to be honest, I really don't like having to paint anything which has got white on it, and anything using stripes, doing it freehand, is always going to be a bit of a problem area. But I think that's turned out quite nicely.
Don't worry, Ambrosius. I think we've got them surrounded.
Now, the Goblin Knights and their steeds do not actually exist in Froud's Book of Goblins. However, I think it's pretty certain from an educated guess that they were originally based on these two goblins, Beck and Call. Because you can see just with the lanky legs sticking out here on the front, we've got the lance and some armor on here, and this guy sitting on this guy's back who's got this big long tail as well. There is just too many similarities that I definitely think that this guy originally started off with this initial design. And these two were famous goblin philosophers who came up with the theory that the length of time spent thinking about any one subject was in inverse proportion to the number of eggs that you could eat, which of course is a very, very useful thing to know. When you see these goblins all together and painted, you can see just how nice they are. The detail on these is absolutely superb. Anyone who is a fan of Jim Henson and the Labyrinth is going to absolutely love these. Let's take a closer look at some of the paints and techniques that I used in order to get these to look like this. So for this little guy, I started off with Tamiya Flat Brown, and this paint goes on really, really nicely, and it dries Tamiya Flat Brown, and this paint goes on really, really nicely, and it dries to a really nice level surface, as long as you work with it really quickly. If you start messing around with it and putting a brush over the top of bits that you've already painted, it will start to lift as it dries with a chemical reaction basically. So you do need to use this quite quickly, but it does give a nice overall dark colour. So I used that all over the entire body of this little guy. After that, I then used Humbrol Matte 62, which is a leather brown, and I used that to dry brush over the top of pretty much all of his clothing. I left the skin alone, but all of his clothing and armor I dry brushed over the top with this color here. If I'm dry brushing, I'm simply going to get some of my lighter color. I'm going to then try and brush off as much of that as possible from my brush, because I really don't want much of that at all. I want my brush to be dry, hence the name dry brushing. And once that's off, I then take the piece that I'm painting, I look at which way the folds are going, so the fold lines and raised lines are going downwards, so that means I want to brush across it. So I'm going to go this way, and by brushing across that with a really dry brush, that starts to pick up the colour of those highlights there. You can see that's starting to work. I'm going to do a little bit more. Getting rid of some more of that. Painting that on a bit more like that. Again, going against the flow, or against the grain, across the grain, and that really highlights that and brings up that colour. I originally had thought that I was going to do this guy with brown clothes, but the closer I looked at the reference material, the more that I saw that his top here, his kind of long sleeved top that he's wearing, should actually be a grey colour. So what I did was, again, I used dry brushing and I went over the top of that top, again with some Revel Mouse Grey, this 47 here, and that's picked up that colour of the grey top quite nicely there. For the armour here on the shoulder, and on covering his belly, I used this here, this metal coat. This is bronze from Humbrol, and I used that to paint that on as a base. And then once that was done, I then gave a little bit of a dry brush over the top with this copper colour. Now both of these are metal paints from Humbrol, so these are designed to be polished once they are on there, and they will come up to quite a nice shine. And you can see it's given us quite a nice dark metal colour on here. For his skin, I actually went with this 242, which is Dunkelgrün, which is basically a very, very kind of dark grey green, but it's more grey than it is green. And I used that in order to base all of the skin, and once that was painted on, I then used this grey from Revel in order to dry brush grey over the top of that darker colour in order to pick up all of the high areas. Once that was done, I used this, which 104, which is Oxford blue. It is blue, but it's a very, very dark blue. It's almost pretty much grey there. And I used that in order to paint the hair, base colour of that for the hair. And then again, once that was dry, I used the grey in order to dry brush and a tiny, tiny touch of white over the top of that in order to bring up the highlights on the hair there. For the top of his head, for this helmet that he's got, that has been base coated actually with this metal coat, this kind of gun metal here. It's a very, very dark colour here. So that is what's been used as the base for this. And then once that was dry, I then used this purple red from Revel in order to dry brush that over the top to bring up those highlights there. For the eyes, I've used this kind of yellowy colour here. Number 63 has been used for the eyes in here. It's then just got a basic black for the pupil that's been painted over the top of that, and then just a basic white that's been done on both eyes in order to add a tiny little bit of light refraction. Now you can see the size of that white compared to, this is my smallest paintbrush that I've got, the size of that white is absolutely tiny. So in fact, I don't use a paintbrush when I'm trying to paint that small. What I will do is I will actually use a pin in order to get that small. So there is the pin that I used, dipping that in the white paint, and use the very tip of the pin in order to add that white detail on there. You're not going to be able to get that small with just a brush unless you've got a brush which is down to like a single hair. For the bag on the back here, I used this kind of reddish brown here from Revel in order to dry brush that over the top of the dark brown that was already there. Once all of that had been painted, I used this satin black from Humbrol here. Now, normally I would not use a satin for this, but I've actually run out of matte black. So I have used a satin, but I do find that if you thin down a satin, then it kind of gets rid of that sheen that you don't want, because you don't want your figures to be glossy, because that just looks really, really horrible. But what I did was I thinned down that satin with some white spirits, and then I used that to paint very carefully into the darkest crevices, like in here. So basically where anything overlaps, so where his arm overlaps his body, I painted in some black in there. Where the shaft of his axe here overlaps his body here, I painted some black in here. Again, where they overlap here. We've got an overlap between the axe here and here and his leg. So painting the black in there, and again more black in here at the backs of his arms, where his arms overlap onto his body. So if I'm using black in order to deepen the shadows, what I'll do is use some of that on the brush. I will then put it into the just white spirits, and what I'm going to do is literally just use 2 dabs of white spirits in order and thin it out on the edge of this old cup that I use, and then I can paint that on. Now that you can see is still a bit too dark there, so I'm going to use even more white spirits in order to thin that down. There you go. So if I was painting that into a crease between an arm and a body, I would paint that on, and once that is painted on into that crease, I would then just use some plain old white spirits with nothing else, and I'd use that to thin out the edges so that it doesn't have hard edges. This one's maybe easier to see here. There you go. If it gets too much black on it, just thin that down, and I'm going to thin down those edges there so that they're not hard edges, but it's still going to be black and keep that darkness in the shadow areas, and that will really help show the 3-dimensional nature of your piece. The base here, I used just this normal black here from Revel, and then once that was done, I then went back to this bronze color, and I've used the bronze to highlight or dry brush over the edges. I used a much bigger brush for this one. And as you can see, the brushes I use are not great quality. The ones that need to be really small, like this one, I do get lots of new, really small ones. But the bigger brushes like this, the fact that it's all kind of splayed like this, I don't really mind, depending on what you're using it for. If I'm dry brushing, then I don't really mind using old brushes which are a bit knackered. So this brush here I use to dry brush, again going down across it like this all the way around to dry brush that metal color onto the base, and then almost kind of stippling on top of there, being very, very careful not to get it onto his boots or anywhere else on him, but stippling rather than doing paint strokes on the base in order to get that metal colour on there.
You shut up! Listen, she's going to say the word.
For this guy, I've again used this flat brown from Tamiya in order to basically base coat the whole thing, and then using that on the clothes here, on the leggings and his top, all the cloth bits, I've done a little bit of a dry brush with this 119, which is light earth, this Humbrol light earth, dry brushed over the top of that very, very lightly, because I wanted to keep it looking quite a dark brown. And then a little bit on his boots here, I've also added a bit of this light grey number 64 from Humbrol, and that did all of the clothing on him. For his armour here, I have gone for a base coat of this polished steel from Humbrol, and once that was on, I then used a dry brush, light dry brush, because I don't want it to be too bright, using this polished aluminium, also from Humbrol, in order to pick up the detail on the helmet. His clothing, or rather his armour, is very rusty in the movie, so really I've just used this brown from Revel, which, although it says it's brown, it is a very, very orangey colour this one, it's really orange. So when that is thinned down with water, you can then kind of paint on the rust in just wherever you want it, where it looks best aesthetically. Normally in the kind of the deep areas, I find is where it would gather. And once you've kind of painted that on and thinned it out, you can then use a bit more, once that's dry, a thicker bit of that to add a deeper kind of orange colour on some of that rust to really kind of make it stand out a bit better. And I think that rust has come up really nicely on his armour there. You can see with his stick, the actual stick part of his nipper stick, I've gone for this reddish brown from Revel here, and in order to pick out that stick and make sure that that brown is a different brown and can be seen against this brown of his back, his clothing here. On his actual nipper stick here, the actual nipper itself, I've painted that with this is a completely random colour I got years and years ago, which is Dusty Rose. Just a really cheap quality acrylic craft paint here. So I painted it with that kind of rose pink, and then I went over and gave it a little bit of a wash with this Citadel, I can't even read this because it's so old. Oh, there we go, it's ripped. Demonette hide. This Demonette hide, which is basically a purple colour, and I really like this for adding kind of purpley veiny colours to things, because these little guys are basically like bird embryos, but they've got very, very thin skin, so there's a lot of pinks and purples in here, and also I've used a very, very basic white. This is just a Revel white here in order to pick out the teeth. Now normally I would not use a white when I was actually doing any kind of painting. I do not like using white because it normally is too stark. But on this scale with this little guy, as long as it's dry brushed on there and not completely painted on, then that white does not pop too much, but it pops enough to draw attention to him over here, which is what you want to do. For the skin on the actual goblins, you can just see his chin in here, and on his fingers I've used a very old one here. This is a Citadel elf flesh, which I think is maybe even discontinued and hasn't been available for years, but I used that as a base coat, and then I used this Citadel dwarf flesh in order to do a little bit of a wash on that, just to add more pinky reddy tones to that colour. And then as well on his nails on here, I've just added a little bit of this light earth colour here from Humbrol, just to pick out the nails and do that, and he looks rather nice. This goblin here, I used again the flat brown as a base coat on the skirt and his war axe here, and then used a tiny bit of this leather colour here in order to dry brush onto the skirt and here, just to pick up a bit of detail. For his red top here, I've used this purple red from Revel as the base colour, and I've done a tiny little bit of dry brushing with, again, this Dusty Rose acrylic here in order to pick up some of these highlight sections. For his armour here, particularly around his shoulders and on his helmet here, I have used again this polished steel as a base, and then I've used a little bit of polished aluminium in order to dry brush on top of that, and I've also used a tiny bit of this kind of this bronze here, because I just wanted to break that up and not have it just plain kind of too much of a greyish colour on there. So I've used a tiny touch of this dry brushing on here as well. And then again, I've used this brown from Revel in order to thin this down and use it to paint on a little bit of rust in places here you can see, which helps bring that detail up. Now, as I said, again, the shoulder armor round here, it varies. In the original kind of the sketches and or particularly the maquette that was built for this character, that is a dark kind of metal irony color. In the movie, however, it seems like it's a much redder color when you see him actually firing the cannon. For his skin here, I've gone for a base coat of this really kind of dark blue grey colour here, this 157. Once that has been painted on his face and his hands, on here his fingers, then that has had a very light dry brush of this mouse grey from Revel here, just to pick up that detail. Again, you can see that the kind of the crinkles on his nose run that way across, so when you're dry brushing down the way there. Got a very little bit of white here to pick up this tooth. We've got a bit more of this brown color here for his little kind of goatee beard, and very difficult, his eyes here are the tiniest out of any of the goblins, including this little guy here. His eyes are even smaller than this guy's eyes. So rather than try to get any kind of color in there, I've just gone for a black on there, and you can also see it's got a tiny white highlight just to make that pop a little bit. In order to do that, again, I've had to use a pen to be able to get that small in order to add that detail there. For the horns, I've used this light earth color here, this 119 from Humbrol, around the base of the horns here, and then graduated that to just a basic kind of white here at the top, just to get that kind of graduation and nice gradient there to pick that out. And again, a little bit of this 119 just on the fingernails here and here, just to make those pop, and using a little bit of this polished aluminium, dry brushed very carefully over the top of these kind of rivet details on his leather skirt, and some of these details here, these actual rivets, just again on all of here, just to make those really pop and stand out. And finally, he's got a tiny little bit of what I believe is probably my dwarf flesh here. Just a little bit of that thinned down and painted over his bottom lip, just to make that pop a little bit more.
Is he going to say it?
Say what? Quiet.
This guy here was probably the easiest to paint because there is mostly all the same kind of thing. There's not lots of little details that are all different colours. It's pretty much all metal, so he was definitely easy to paint. And as you probably guessed by now, using a lot of the same colours. So used this polished steel here as a base coat for all of the metal work from head to, well, not toe, but from head to waist on this guy. That was then followed by a light dry brush of this polished aluminium here over the top of those details. I also did a little bit of this bronze dry brushed over some of those details just to pick that up a bit. And again, I used some of this copper to dry brush over some of those details to add a bit more flavour to it. And again, using this brown thinned down from Revel in order to go in and add some of that rust detail in places because this guy being mainly made of metal, he's got lots of bits of rust all over him. The trousers here were simply this this leather colour here, which had a little bit of this light earth dry brushed over it, and the shoes were this flat brown here with again this light earth dry brushed over the top of it. Now, one thing I did kind of hum and haw about on him is this part up here, this kind of periscope. I have seen on other ones that people have painted, particularly the original sculptor of this piece, I think, has got this painted as an eye with white and an iris and a pupil, which does really look quite nice, but from watching the film very, very carefully, I could not see that detail as being an eyeball. I just couldn't see that detail. It's a nice idea, but it doesn't really seem to be film accurate. What does appear to be in the film is a kind of eye, but a definite, there's only really this kind of ring of this bronzy colour here. So what I did was I did exactly that. I painted this bit black, and then I used this bronze colour in order to paint a circle on there with a tiny black bit in the middle. And this, as far as I can see, is what you see in the movie rather than like an actual eyeball with the white and the iris and the pupil and all of that. So this was quite easy to paint. And again, as with all of these figures, I used my satin black, which I thinned down a lot with white spirits and used that to paint into the deep details. Again, particularly right around here and around these sections here, and where the pipes meet the body here and here, and this deep kind of bit here. So these, anywhere where it's kind of deep, like in here or under the arms here or around this crevice, and anywhere where there's deep folds, I kind of painted that black in and then used pure white spirits, thinned down pure white spirits, in order to blend out the edges on that and get rid of any hard lines, so you get a nice gradient on that. And this guy turned out really nice.
Miss!
Okay, come on!
And finally we come on to the Goblin Knight here, which is definitely my favourite piece. And for this I kind of started with the knight himself here. And for this, because he's got this deep red, I used this purple red from Revel as a base coat for all of the knight there. I left his steed alone, but everything else on the knight I painted with this purple red here. I then went and in with his his trousers or his leggings here, which is a much brighter red. I hit with some Ferrari red. Again, I just kind of thinned that down a little bit and used that to paint his leggings, just to make them a different colour from the rest of his armour, because his leggings are material, whereas his armour is kind of a metal, obviously. That obviously has got some highlights on it in gold, and for that I just used this metal 54 Humbrol, sorry, this gold here in order to paint that on some of those highlights. And that was basically it for the armour. All the rest of it is the black, again, that thinned down satin black, thinned with the white spirits, and using that to paint into the crevices here, particularly where there are any kind of overlaps. Again, painting it into there and making sure that you then use a pure white spirit in order to blend that out. And that was enough to get all the dark bits in his armour there. The lance that he's got here, again, the same colour of that purple red as his armour there. I then used the white from Revel in order to kind of paint the stripes on there. In fact, what was easier is you find painting anything white is a bit of a pain. So what I actually did was I tried to paint that all white first of all, and then painted the red stripes over the top of it. Which turns out to be a lot easier. On the bottom part here, there is this sculpted detail in here, so you can use that to follow that for the colors. But for this is all flat, so you're going to have to do that by hand. And you will find there is quite a lot of going back and forth. So you might paint on some red on top of the white and do a little bit over, and in that case you have to wait for it to dry and then paint the white over the top of that red, and then if you splodge over again you have to paint the red on top of the white again. So you've got to be really patient with this and be prepared to go back and forth on it. Again, a little bit of gold detail down here at the bottom, and up here the actual spike on the top. Again, that's some of that polished steel with some polished aluminium dry brushed over the top of that. Once he was done, his boots there obviously are that dark brown, and for that I've used again that flat brown there for his boots. I didn't really do any kind of highlighting on his boots because I wanted them to be very dark. And his fingers, you can just see his fingers here and here holding the hair. Again, they were done with the kind of elf flesh colour from Citadel, and then making sure that that was darkened down with a little bit of a darker wash using this kind of tanny brown colour here, just to get a bit darker in here. And again, the nails on here have been painted using pretty much a straight version of that 119 colour there. And then once all that was done, I then went on to painting his steed. And his steed here I have painted all over with this olive green from Revel as a base colour, and then I have dry brushed this fern green over the top of it. Again, you can see the creases are going this way on the sculpt there, so when dry brushing you want to be dry brushing downwards across any creases. Once that whole thing was painted, I then used, let me see if I can find where it's gone. I then used this flat brown in order to paint all of the stomach area here of this goblin mount. And then once that was dry, I then used this leather colour here, this 62 from Humbrol, in order to dry brush that much kind of lighter kind of orangey colour over the top of that brown. Again, the creases are going that way, so you dry brush down the way, and picked all that out, and then went back with just that straight flat brown in order to paint that strap back in there. And again, that's the same strap, the same colour that I've used on the base of the seat there. For his eyes, I used this purple red to base coat the eyes. Once I'd done that, I then used a very little bit of this orange from Revel in order to kind of do, I suppose, what you might call irises, really, but it was more highlighting the middle section of the eye. And then again, using a pin in order to get some black pupil on there, and again using a pin in order to get that white spot highlights on there, which just really make those eyes pop. And you can see with the dry brushing, with the lighter green on top of the dark green, just that from dry brushing alone, you get the really nice detail on the face. The hair there is a kind of darker grey colour, which I believe I used just this matte grey here, and then used a little bit of white in order to dry brush that on top across. See, the hair's going down this way, so you dry brush across the way, and I've done that on all the hair. And then again, like I've done on everything else, once that is all dry, I then used the satin black thinned down with some white spirits in order to paint it into the crevices and the overlaps on here, particularly around here. The crevices where his leg overlaps his belly in here, same as where any part of the goblin overlaps onto his body here. You want to make sure it's dark in here and here, and make sure so anywhere that you would have shadows has got that dark black on it. And again, the base is just done exactly the same on all of them with a basic black base, which has then been highlighted in that kind of copper colour or bronze, and that was him. So if you stuck around this long, I hope that's been of use to you. These really were great fun to paint up. The detail on these and the sculpt is absolutely beautiful, and when they are painted up, they look lovely. These are definitely ones that you're going to be wanting to use in any kind of miniature game that you've got. From all accounts, the Labyrinth board game itself does not have very good playability. It's not a particularly good game, but it is one that looks absolutely gorgeous. So you're definitely going to be wanting to use these in something else, even if it's as miniatures in Dungeons and Dragons or something like that. A thought that did occur to me is if you could afford to buy enough of these, enough packs of these as a custom chess set would be amazing. But I think that would be a rather expensive undertaking to have enough of these goblins in order to be able to make a full set. So we're going to have to make do with what we've got here. But as I say, they look great, and I hope that has been of benefit, of some use to you. If anybody else actually does paint these up, particularly if you're using the colours which I've suggested here, then really let me know about it. Have you played this game? Have you painted these up? Have you had a go at using these as an expansion, or just use these in any other game that you've got? I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to hear your experiences. Until next time, should you ever need us, we'll be right here waiting. This is Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.